Look, it's fun to go on the internet and hate on things. It's probably one of my favorite pastimes. People like to have their negative opinions validated, or they get a rush getting angry about people disliking things that they love. It boils down to the fact that it's fun to argue about things that are ultimately inconsequential, right? And regardless of my opinion, I figured I owed it to you, as my big lore video is about to crest 1 million views, and I can't honestly make a lore video on The Watcher that isn't just wildly speculative, because it's missing a lot. So I want to assure you that while I am historically a hater of anything popular, even going so far as to flip and dislike things once they've become popular, I really wanted to love The Watcher. I was really disappointed, but I don't know if it's going to be for the reasons most people think. I'm going to throw up a spoiler warning, but beyond mechanics, there's nothing really to spoil. End-game stuff, but I'm not going to show any of that. And I'm going to keep visuals mostly to the early areas of the game. This is mostly an audio video for you guys. It's not really going to be anything to watch. So let's address the lore problem first. Why isn't this a lore video? How can I talk about the lore first, right after my big spoiler warning? Well, the reality is that there's nothing to really dig into. In the base game, we had lore pearls and we had interactions with characters to present them. In Downpour, we got even more, alongside new broadcasts that really felt like you were eavesdropping on a developing crisis. In The Watcher, we get a couple interactions with a couple of characters. Now, there are plenty of new areas, but the world building expressed through them is minimal at best and entirely isolated to that area at worst. And can I just say, I'm sick of the rot, man. The rot is relevant, but the plot relevance feels weak. And it feels like it was put here not because of that relevance, but because it pads the difficulty and length. It isn't fun. It's good for the world building in the base game and Downpour, but those are also mechanically among the worst areas in those games. There's a bit of a narrative reading for it, but I find it doesn't justify the increased tedium and diminished enjoyment. Even the Downpour devs knew this. They talked about it being a crutch in their in-game commentary. Anyway, that's it for the additional story, pretty much. You're exploring zones without a purpose beyond the several minimal character interactions. There's rot relevance, and there's not much else I can say without spoiling those parts, but I can say that those interactions felt weirdly antagonistic to me. To the point I felt like the game was mocking me through the dialogue for trying to enjoy it. This is likely where I'm going to get the most angry comments, and that's fine. If you enjoyed the new story content, I'm very happy for you. I'm probably going to be told I didn't get it. I get it, I just didn't like it, and that's a pretty important distinction to make. I also want to clarify that I do think it's mostly in line with the base game, and I think it's fine that it essentially sidelines Downpour to an alternate universe. I was expecting that, in fact. We knew Downpour had tenuous canonicity. And we know they're capable of a more involved story because it's present in the base game. I'd also argue that it would seem, from my perspective, that story is what hooked people the most. I can't tell you how many comments I got on my lore video stating that they were going to come back after playing the game, but more importantly, I can't tell you the number of comments I got saying that they had given up on it until watching my video. There's a massive community surrounding fanfiction too. The people love the story. And I think that running light on it was a real misstep. I also think that it's a result of the release deadline, so it's probably time to talk about the article. In an article released on the same day as the DLC, we got an interview with Video Cult co-founder James Therian, and in that interview, he said, "The biggest challenge was cramming all the ideas and content we had in before some sort of reasonable deadline, and we only sorta accomplished that. It looks like there's going to be a few post-release updates and some final reveals when it releases on console." I don't like to speculate on the development process. I think it's bad form. I think it's unprofessional. I don't, however, have a problem addressing things that come straight from the horse's mouth, so to speak, and I can't help but wonder if this lack of relevant world-building content is a consequence of those development deadlines. I would hope we can expect to see something like that eventually, but it's a huge ask. It seems unlikely, and to be honest, it doesn't fix any of my other problems. So let's get into those. We're on to regions now because it's really hard to quantify spoilers for this DLC, but I know you guys are pretty sensitive to them, and that's reasonable, so I'm going to discuss these new regions, but I'm not going to discuss specific endgame spoiler regions beyond maybe some vague references, or a traversal of them with any new mechanics. I'll save that for the mechanics section. While some of these new regions are pretty, a lot of them are pretty rough. One of the absolute best parts of the base game, and by extension Downpour, was how coherent the world felt. It was the realization that you were scaling a massive machine, or that the reason the area below it was pitch black was because it was literally blocking out the sun. It was reading lore about the drill they used to drill deep into the earth, and then finding the drill in person, and having that awesome moment. It's environmental storytelling at its finest, and that is almost entirely absent from The Watcher. It's just not there. A big part of that is how these regions are structured, but I don't want to talk about that until I get to mechanics, so suffice it to say, they're not particularly large and they're disjointed. There are a lot of them, like 20 odd regions, but it absolutely ruined my immersion going from, for example, a desert to a rainy, flooded train. Half my early gameplay was spent in really difficult iterator-themed machine rooms, and man, there's a serious lack of new creatures. In my first, let's say, 7 hours with this DLC, I could count on one hand the number of new critters I saw, but you know what I saw a ton of? Lizards. Just tons and tons of lizards. Oops, all lizards. Why? 20 new regions, they're predominantly lizards? Come on now, that's pretty hard to write off. And they're hard, man. Like, I get that some people want that, but I felt like I was playing Kaizo Mario levels here. Now, I'll admit that I probably lost a lot of my muscle memory in my time away from the game, so it's hard to hold that against it, really, but it's definitely a step up in difficulty, and the game is already a hard game. Let's not mince words here. Rain World is a difficult, inaccessible game that's received cult status, but it was originally panned because of how hard it was. Back on release, IGN gave it a 6.3 out of 10, and the biggest reason was the difficulty. GameSpot gave it a 5. Look, I don't put a lot of stock in these places, but I think it's important to pull receipts here. The game was panned for being too hard. It's always been hard. That's not a bad thing. It's part of why I loved it, but it's a divisive thing. This DLC is, in my opinion, a significant step up in that difficulty. So you're doing harder platforming in smaller, disconnected areas, lots of rot, so insta-kills, and predominantly lizards. It feels like they chose quantity over quality, and I didn't care for that. So, we're on to mechanics now. I don't really think anything here is a big deal, but some of you might, so here you go, here's your spoiler warning. But I'm going to get into like how my personal perspective has changed too, a little later on, and I think that might have a lot to do with my opinions here. Just wanted to give you a couple seconds to click off, so alright, we're getting into mechanics. The reason that these regions are all so disconnected is that you're warping between them through portals. That's right. They're totally isolated. We're pulling a Rick and Morty, in and out, 20 minutes adventure. It feels bad. To add insult to injury, they're full of dead ends, because you're essentially searching for those encounters I mentioned earlier. That's the gameplay. It feels like a needle in a haystack scenario. You couple it with the difficulty increase, and after a couple of dead ends, it starts to wear on you fast. You can turn invisible, but the animation takes a while, so you're in and out of it with all these momentum-killing pauses. Your later abilities are also tied to your karma level, which makes death really punishing, and look, death has always been punishing, but I think it felt worse, and maybe that's just because I was frustrated. Food and shelter are super scarce, so it makes grinding it back up really tedious, especially because you really don't know where you're going. A lot of Rain World's design, in hindsight, is pretty linear. You're almost always going from point A to point B. Not so much here, and I did find myself enjoying it a bit more once I stopped focusing so hard on finding those encounters, but I don't think that was because it was a good experience. I think it was because Rain World is just good in general, and it didn't matter. There's also nothing to unlock at all. It's a new campaign, and that's it. It doesn't even interface with Downpour. You can't load the Watcher up in expeditions. There's nothing in the sandbox. There's no multiplayer. It's just entirely isolated. And look, I understand not wanting to make people buy both DLCs, but you can't even change the colors, and this was a huge issue for me. I'm not even particularly visually impaired. I mean, I wear glasses, but I could not consistently find my character. It felt antagonistic for the sake of it. Half of the areas I was in were snowstorms, and all I could see were my white little eyes trying to track those. This is an accessibility issue, and the color change options are built into the game. So why can't I do it still 3 months out? Even the launch was rocky. I mean, for the first 2 hours it revoked people's Downpour DLC and they couldn't play either. Now, credit where credit is due, stuff like that happens all the time, and they had it fixed within 2 hours, but it was a frustrating experience. It's been a frustrating experience. So, I guess that brings us to my perspective. And between the last big video and now, I became a dad. I talk about that a lot, but if you haven't watched anything else from me, now you know. My life has fundamentally changed, and like they tell you it will, and you know it's going to, but it's like some Lovecraftian forbidden knowledge. You literally just do not get it until it happens. And I love playing games. I love playing difficult games, punishing games. I'm a massive Dark Souls fan, and my favorite FromSoft game may very well be Sekiro, which is the hardest one by far. I'm no wimp. But I can't play stuff like this anymore. I mean, not really. I don't have the patience for such a frustrating experience. I get a lot less time to play stuff. I'm not going to suffer through something I don't enjoy with such minimal progress. And I would say, hey, if you gave me the Souls games today for the first time, I wouldn't get into them as much either, but I don't know that that's fundamentally true. The RNG in Rain World has a mean streak. It's always been there. There's an inherent cruelty to the design, and that's what makes it appealing. It really feels like a world that's out to get you. But whether my perspective has changed or the Watcher is designed in a worse way, I just didn't enjoy it enough to even finish it. I couldn't. I threw in the towel in about 7 minutes shy of 13 hours. It should not take that long of not enjoying something to decide if I like it, and I don't. Now, do I think it's worth $15? That depends on you. There's a lot of content present, I just think it's significantly worse content. It's still at the core Rain World, and I love Rain World. I started to have a bit of fun again once I accepted that. I don't think it's fair to compare it to Downpour either, because Downpour was wildly underpriced in my opinion. That DLC was a massive labor of love, and tons of people hated Downpour for feeling like it strayed from the game's vision, and that's fair too. If I was more like how I used to be, I'd probably have been in that group, because it's what brought attention to the game. But I've been with Rain World since the PS4 release, since it was published by Adult Swim, and all the way through the modding era to the Nintendo Switch, and up until now. It was a niche indie title. The Steam review graph does not lie. Downpour brought the game mainstream success. And I do think that The Watcher has some of those elements of the base game that may have been lost in translation to Downpour. Translation that made it more palatable, easier to swallow. And I can't blame them for trying something new. These guys have always come across to me as art guys. I've seen interviews and stuff. You're not going to ask an artist to paint the same painting twice. That's not what they do. If this was their core vision for a direct continuation of Rain World, then who am I to tell them they're wrong, that they missed the mark? But I do think they missed the mark. Downpour brought them mainstream success. It was lightning in a bottle. The Watcher just feels like a flash in the pan.